So we continue with 1204, a little more reading in chapter 5 and sort of summary. I do have to point out it's quite a bit to digest. It is not the normal way we perceive these things at all. We usually see meanings as residing I don't know where. When I studied linguistics, intention was always in the sky, never mentioned, just assumed. It's the no knowledge of common sense seeped into academia. And the more they investigated once that path was taken, the more they left reality, the less meaning was accessible. And I think that is a trend within all academia, but especially linguistics, neurology, and science of cognition. Because the most revelations has been within these areas. One could say, a bit exaggerated, but it took a while before quantum mechanics entered into these areas. And it shows what we take as a foundational without even knowing it. That's the thing. Without even having any idea what we have assumed and what that would mean, we have made frontiers, borders, without looking into if those borders really exist. And they are playing out their own thing. A little bit like if you buy a car, which happened to me actually, I bought a car, and there was a thing installed in the car under the hood. And I always assumed that to be purposeful for some reason. It was a sort of, it looked like an insulation. I thought maybe that will lower the sound level or something of the engine. And I think that's normal. To be honest, I didn't make much assumption. It was there when I bought it, and therefore I didn't think about it. Whereas, would have I thought about it, I would have noticed this car is extremely silent as it is. And once I remove this fire-inducing thing, because they were made of sort of foam material, plastics, that it could have ignited. It was inflammable. Not very much, but enough to cause maybe a disaster for the car. It had no purpose whatsoever. And think about these things. They are inherited. They came in common sense. And since common sense is already established once we entered academia, and that goes for all the researchers, we are ruled by them. We are ruled by things we don't know about. And now the floodlights are being pushed to that side. We look into that area and we see what we used to think is intention is completely dark. We have no idea, we just say the word intention and that's it. And now we start to discover, and all of a sudden, extension is not as clear as it used to be at all. And you see how these pairs have been working. The one constructing the other one. And although this, for me, when I read the book louder and words, still seem to be very clear. They're nothing of the kind. You could say that clear is the furthest they are from anything. They are hidden, unknown, tricky, and they stop thinking at its very inception. And once they are there, they will hinder you from thinking further. They will actually, in this special case, cause a lot of harm. because they inflict harm to the very understanding itself, whereas the misunderstanding with the car wouldn't inflict any harm other than to make the car more inflammable or might cause an accident. This is in a way worse because it stops thinking. If we assume this, we are bound no longer to understand things, anything. All concepts, all verbs, all nouns are motor actions. And every time we think in these categories, we stop them like this, head on. And I used to think a language was working by itself. No, it's not. Your foundations, and the more you strive in that region, for every time you repeat it, you will block the motor activation. And if you go under a certain level, if you go under this level, awareness will no longer be. We know that a certain amount of fractality is an absolute necessity for awareness. And what happened is we swept under this, and that made it impossible. And I think it would be impossible for most people to reach into these findings, because the level of awareness, attention, consciousness is just too low. Just like Rudolf Garcia, the author of The Taint of the Mirror, wrote, once nullification, that is the obfuscation, obliteration of knowing and understanding has gone far enough, there is no point of return, because we no longer feel when we have awareness or knowledge. And as I briefly mentioned in the previous lecture, how can I explain this? Illegitimate concepts sweep in, and they block effectively all understanding. They are like big, dark building blocks similar to this one. There is a theory that is similar that has been going on for a while. It is quite different. I don't know how much is based on science, but it's similar enough. It's called neuro-linguistic programming. And it seems to, without a history or an explanation, to assume the same thing, that words are actions. When I read about that, I didn't like it at all. The reason being, this is not founded on something. It needs for you to try it out and see if it works. And of course, then you have to be over a certain level, because we can literally not feel anything anymore. We don't know if we are treading on the right path or not. That's why science is the liberator here. Without science, we are completely lost. Science will provide us a stepping stone to get back to ourselves, to become whole once more, and to make our thinking working. Until that time, it is high enough to go above this level. And then you can make the decisions you like. You can abandon science, you don't need it anymore. But you need to develop awareness at least. Otherwise, there is no chance of change anyhow. But the resistance is enormous. Just the simple fact that this has been the case, using these things within sports psychology has been about for 20-25 years now. Because they don't care about dogmas, they care about results. And this does give results. And now we can also build a sort of, not dogma, I don't want to see any more dogmas, but some sort of foundation that can be falsified. And this is what Slowly, little by little, in an excellent manner, Benjamin Bergen is building up a convincing proof why this is the fact. And that, of course, takes it further away from NLP, because I'm quite sure even those who were completely unenthusiastic about NLP, I had friends who were that when it was popular in the 90s, they wouldn't be putting it into action, because the simple fact we can't convince ourselves something we don't understand. And I think that's an important factor. There is no possibility of convincing the whole system this is true. You need to understand it. And that's another thing of this blocking out the subject, is that we think we can do anything. We think we can, our thinking capacity makes it possible to think about contradictory things, that we can construct our own life worlds. We can't even construct enough to make us move in a different manner, a more healthy, more salutogenous manner. We can't teach ourselves how to predict the future. None of those things are possible without this understanding. None. And saying that you can think whatever you want and that your thinking is free, somehow it's just nonsensical. It's beyond belief. It is an hyperbole, megalomaniac hyperbole. And it's very similar to a mental patient who interviewed is going to ask, I'm Julius Caesar, I'm Napoleon. It is a sort of helping up the ego by saying that in a lighter manner. People before tried to believe in NLP because they thought it would give them some benefits. And I think it most possibly would have, but they wouldn't be able to manage to understand or believe, because belief only comes from understanding. And disbelief needs arguments, it needs convincing, and I think that has to be done on a regular basis. And that might be the reason for the stream of apologetics that are turning up now. The people are helping people who don't believe, helping, giving them a shot, like a drug dealer giving someone some narcotics to keep the disbelief at bay, they think. But you can only believe if you know the motor action. And belief is not so much as understanding. And I will get to that in later lectures. But understanding does come at a cost. And thank God, I will say before, it would have cost and it wouldn't even be possible, no matter how much energy you put into this. This understanding is what makes understanding possible. So it's a higher level of understanding. And that's why the misunderstanding was so catastrophic within neurology, linguistics, semantics. I realized I spent my energy on nothing, and the more I strived in that direction, the less I got. And that would have been something that could have continued for eternity. I'll go back to some more analysis soon. The bigger point here, though, is that I continue to read from chapter 5 more than words. The bigger point here, though, is that grammatical person seems to modulate the perspective you adopt when performing embodied simulation. This isn't to say that every time you hear you think about yourself as a participant in a simulated actions. But it does mean that the grammatical person in a sentence pushes you toward being more likely to adopt one perspective or another. What's interesting about this is that in this case, grammar appears not to be telling you what to simulate, but rather how to simulate. What perspective to simulate the event from. Instead of acting as the script in this case, grammar is acting as the director. Entrat Ingmar Bergman. Grammatical aspect modulates simulation focus. What's the difference between saying that the alarm clock was ringing and the alarm clock had rung? Or between the children were lining up for lunch and the children had lined up for lunch? All these sentences describe situation in the past using the past tense, because was, were, had are all past tense forms of the respective verbs. But at the relevant time in the past, the events they describe appear to be at different stages. In the scene described by the alarm clock was ringing, the alarm clock is in the middle of the act of ringing. By contrast, with the alarm clock had rung, at the point in time described by the sentence, the alarm clock is no longer ringing. Grammatical distinctions like these among different framings or views on the same event fall under the category of grammatical aspect. Broadly speaking, whereas tense provides an indication of when a described event takes place, aspect marks the structure of the event, whether it's ongoing, completed, beginning, and so on. Every human language encodes grammatical aspects of one type or another. The most widely discussed aspectual distinction in English is between progressive, which linguists argue accentuates the internal structure of an event, and the perfect, which they claim encapsulates or shuts off access to the described process, while highlighting the resulting end state. Native speakers, even those untrained in linguistic analysis, usually agree with these intuitions when you ask them to decide whether events are completed or to match pictures to sentences. John is closing the drawer. Progressive highlights internal structure of the event. John has closed the drawer. Perfect highlights the resulting end state of an event. Behavioral evidence using finer tools point to the same conclusion. For instance, one study had people read narratives several sentences long, in which one critical sentence used either the perfect or the progressive. Then, after they were done reading, they performed a memory test in which they saw a description of that same event, but without tense or aspect marking. For instance, closed drawer, and had to decide whether that particular event had been mentioned in the narrative. The participants turn out to be significantly faster to say that the event had been mentioned when it had originally appeared in the narrative with progressive rather than perfect aspect. This seems to indicate that the progressive does indeed allow greater access to or activation of a representation of the described event. And another work demonstrates that you get the same effect if you have people try to recognize the entities involved in the mentioned events. It's easier to remember that John was mentioned in a narrative if he showed up in a sentence using progressive rather than perfect aspect. Complementary evidence on the function of the perfect comes from other work, which found that perfect sentences increase end state focus when compared with the progressive counterparts. In that work, participants read either progressive or perfect sentences, then saw an image depicting the event in an ongoing state, or a completed state. The experimenters found that participants responded to completed state pictures faster than ongoing state pictures following perfect sentences. This suggests that the participants were not representing the internal structure of events described with the perfect, so much as their resulting end states. These findings compellingly demonstrates that progressive aspect increases access to or activation of internal components of described events, and that perfect aspects does the same for the resulting end state of events. It seems natural then to ask how this difference in access or degree of activation is fleshed out in differences in embodied simulation. It's known that embodied simulations can differ in the degree of detail or granularity with which particular parts of scenes are simulated. If I ask you to imagine your kitchen sink, your mental image might not at first include such details as the color of the molding around the basin or the shape of the drain mouth. But when called upon to mentally represent these ideas, these details, the mind's eye can increase the zoom of the lens through which the imagined object is viewed. And the literature on intentional mental imagery is rich with demonstrations of this. So a simulation-based account on the function of aspect might predict that sentences with progressive aspect should yield greater embodied simulation of the process or nucleus of the described event than should corresponding perfect descriptions. Conversely, the function of the perfect to highlight the end state of an action or to increase the intensity of simulation directly pertaining to the end states of described events, while decreasing simulation of nucleus of the event. We tested these predictions in our lab using action-sentence compatibility effect paradigm, which by now will be very familiar to you. This is the type of study where people are shown to perform actions compatible with those implied by sentences faster than incompatible ones. In line with previous work, we included sentences that described action toward or away from the body and had people respond by moving their hand toward or away from their bodies. The key innovation in our studies was to manipulate grammatical aspect. We had people read either progressive sentences or perfect sentences. If what progressive aspect does for simulation is to augment mental focus on the ongoing action, then we should see a robust action sentence compatibility effect with the progressive sentences. And if perfect aspect really does shut off embodied simulation of the ongoing action itself, then we should see no action sentence compatibility effect with perfect sentences. And that's what we found. The most plausible explanation for these results is that although progressive sentences drive understanders to mentally simulate the internal processes of described events, perfect sentences evoke less of this simulation. What studies like these show is that whereas content words like marry, drawer, or open point to specific experiences that can be simulated, like entities, states, events, or properties, grammatical aspect like grammatical person operates over the representations evoked by content words. Grammar appears to modulate what part of an evoked simulation someone is invited to focus on, the grain of detail which the simulation is performed, or what perspective to perform that simulation from. What grammar tells us. One of the things that makes human language unique among animal communication systems is its highly developed use of grammar. As a result, figuring out how grammar works takes us a long way toward understanding what makes us, our cognitive system, unique. This chapter has laid out evidence that grammar contributes to embodied simulation in 3 ways. First, grammar combines and thereby constrains the contributions that individual words make to embodied simulation. Second, grammar attributes meaning of its own. Again, unlike other communication systems. And third, it modulates embodied simulation, indicating not what to simulate, but how to simulate it. The idea that grammar modulates embodied simulation is enough to make a linguist's imagination run wild. What other pieces of grammar modulate embodied simulation? Does the fact that barley is singular while oats is in plural makes you simulate a pile of oats as being bigger or having more individual grains in it than a pile of barley? If you're a native speaker of language like Spanish, where all nouns have grammatical gender, do you mentally simulate a bridge, un puente, as having masculine characteristics, but a key, una llave, as having feminine characteristics? Is the difference between active, Mary punched John, or John was punched by Mary, partly whose perspective you adopt? And the list goes on. Quantum revolution in linguistics, I might say. This last example brings up a critical and related issue. That's the issue of word order. One difference between Mary punched John and John was punched by Mary is the order in which Mary and John are mentioned. When you read or listen to language, you do so word by word in order. This raises a question. Does the order of words affect the order of your embodied simulations? Do differences in word order across languages affect the order in which people simulate entities and events? And do you simulate as you go through a sentence, word by word, or do you hold off until all the words are in before launching in an embodied situation? In the next chapter, we'll take a little time to talk about this temporal dimension of simulation. That's chapter 6. I will struggle on with my summary here. I would say one thing is overused in Western Hemisphere, and I think that comes already from the Greek, and that's argumentation or contradiction. Argumentation seems to be very effective. But if we look into argumentation, what it does, it is purely negate something. It doesn't go into the structure. It doesn't reveal what's inside of what the argumentation attacks or is against. It makes everything superficial. It is very similar to intention extension. Argumentation is lazy. It means that you don't finish off the project. It means that you're too lazy even to maybe the thing that you want to argument against, or you intuitively or rationally understand it's not a good thing. If you go to argumentation, you don't stop anything. You don't go into the details. You don't go into the machinery. If you want to rebuild something of a sewing machine into, let's say, a household equipment, something that makes spaghetti, you need to open up the sewing machine, not destroy it with a hammer, or as argumentation does, put it in a box and negate it. And I realized that language is much deeper than we understand. And people who argue for monosemism are really damaged people. People who cannot reach into language, who cannot progress in language, and who cannot express themselves. And of course I come to think about my old linguistic professor. He was incredibly unskilled in language. And I don't think he was that way once upon a time when he started his education. This is blunting all the tools we have. It's blunting the exercise. It's like going to a gym and getting a schedule for completely wrong exercises. A whole series that will break your back. It won't develop your muscles. Some of the exercises will overexert you, and some others will not put any strain on your muscles. We become horribly blunt. All of academia, as I experienced, it was a bluntness. It was just showing with the whole hand, argumenting against something, negating, and that's it. Pure laziness. Because they haven't developed the acute and decisive skills in thinking that could do a precise analyzing, a precise intellectualization, a precise reflection. And oddly enough, this is exactly what Rodolphe Gachet was pointing to, the death of intellectuality in the West. And this is because these tendencies has gone too far. We become so blunt, so we negate everything, or do the opposite. We adhere to it and we push it. And then I was thinking in the perfect inflection of a verb, to putting something in the perfect tense. everything stops. It's the end result. And argumentation is a perfect tense. It stops there. Nothing more happens. And I'm quite sure these tendencies were not as strong once upon a time, because people still were above the awareness level. They were not minus A, if you call that awareness, attention, or consciousness. They were plus, so they could still react. And there's a good example in Gauss, the mathematician, when asked about infinity and eternity and things within mathematics that went on for ever and ever and ever, he said, those are very practical things, but of course they couldn't be seen as real. This meant he still was a whole person. He was still being embodied in himself. And that later disappeared about 40, 50 years later with the Paris Conference of Mathematics, where Hilbert, and I would say at that point 80% of the mathematicians thought that math was some other world. Math is embodied. If you want to be skilled in mathematics, it has to be embodied. Of course, you can deny it, but that's a fact. And I would think most of the mathematicians still had some skills because they were working with it. But we other sorts, we laymen, we become the victims of this trend, because it stops thinking. And the effect is always worse in common man because they don't practically engage and therefore constantly stimulate thinking by doing things. Because that's the only way of stimulating thinking in the beginning. You need to do it until you acquire the skill to go into the potential side of awareness, where everything lies dormant, and affect that. And then you venture into the place where effects are actually possible, where volition, your want, has something to see what happens. Otherwise, under the awareness line, you will be, as Ben Ligbitz proved, you will react immediately. You will have no free will whatsoever because you're not aware of your own potential thinking. And therefore, you cannot influence it for better or worse, usually for better because you're in controlling agent. And therefore, you leave everything to be random. You stop the buck here, you use perfect sense and tense and say, the argument is closed here, I don't like it. That's lazy, that is non-goal oriented, and actually you have nothing to rebuild, so you will need to stick with the old one until it changes by evolution, like for instance some linguistic theories that just went out of the window without anybody actively disagreeing with them, because evolution, the slow change in thinking, led us to understand these are no longer goods. That's the long, tedious, non-volitional, non-thinking way of going about things. It is ineffective, and above all, it's excruciatingly slow. And evolution is what we are using in thinking today. We just threw some thinking out by happenstance, and maybe one of those thoughts are good. The message from Louder Than Words is you can influence your own thinking. You can take charge of it, and you can become someone who can think abstractly. You don't simply react anymore. That's the escape from the Pavlovian dog scenario. You're no longer somebody who just reacts to the environment, because you don't know that the environment and you are coupled. You will actually react not even to the environment, but your old subjective representations of that environment, what you think about it. And as classical physics, I like this parallel, it's not shared by anyone. That's being a classical physical guy. You don't share anything. You cannot communicate time, space, object, scale, relations, nothing. You can only, if you work in it in a very thin layer, we actually use classical mechanics, the 1,000%. There you can use it, because you practically use it to build something. So it's a very positive message. And finally, linguistics has come to this point to liberate us from, I would say, the prison of this. This is quite literally a thinking prison. And I would say, as long as this is in place, and that is always in place in ordinary language, always present before you enter into university or study anything, it's present in common media. Until that point, you sort of open that up. You are locked, and I guess you'll be to the day you die. You don't have to do that anymore. It can be opened up. I say thank you very much and have a, let's see here, very pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye for now.